That's enough, Mom. We've heard this story 100 times already, my daughter Jennifer said, cutting me off mid-sentence as I tried to explain why the neighborhood had changed so much since they were children. The room fell silent except for the soft clink of coffee cups against saucers. My son David nodded in agreement, exchanging that look with his wife Rebecca, the one that said, "Here goes Grandma again." I watched as my own grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, glanced up from their phones just long enough to roll their eyes before returning to their screens. Something cold settled in my chest as I realized they weren't just dismissing my words, they were dismissing me entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Rose Fletcher, though everyone has called me Maggie since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. At 73 years old, I've lived in the same craftsman-style house in Pasadena, California for 48 years. The house sits on a tree-lined street where the jacaranda blooms paint the sidewalks purple every spring, and where I raised my 2 children after my husband Robert passed away from a heart attack when he was only 51. That was 22 years ago, but the house still carries the echo of his laughter in the kitchen where he used to make Sunday pancakes, and the faint scent of his aftershave seems to linger in the hallway closet where his old jackets still hang. I suppose from the outside, my life might look ordinary, even predictable. I wake every morning at 6:30, make myself a cup of Earl Grey tea with 1 sugar cube, and sit in the sunroom reading the Los Angeles Times while the morning light filters through the lace curtains my mother crocheted 60 years ago. I tend to my garden where roses climb the white picket fence and tomatoes grow in neat rows beside the kitchen window. I volunteer 3 days a week at the local historical society, cataloging old photographs and helping visitors trace their family genealogies. On Thursdays, I play bridge with 3 other widows at the community center, and on Sundays, I attend the 10 o'clock service at St. Mark's Episcopal Church, sitting in the same pew where Robert and I sat for 31 years of marriage. But what my family sees as repetitive routine, I see as the careful preservation of a life well lived. Every habit, every tradition, every story I tell carries weight and meaning that spans decades. When I mention how the Hendersons used to live next door before they moved to Phoenix, I'm not just making conversation, I'm keeping alive the memory of how Mrs. Henderson brought soup when Robert was sick, how Mr. Henderson helped me fix the broken sprinkler system, how their daughter Sarah used to babysit Jennifer and David for 50 cents an hour. When I talk about the old grocery store that used to be where the Starbucks now stands, I'm remembering the butcher who knew exactly how thick to slice the ham for Robert's sandwiches, the produce manager who saved the best strawberries for regular customers, the cashier who asked about the children by name. These aren't just random recollections floating through an aging mind, they're the threads that weave together the fabric of a community, a family, a lifetime. But somewhere along the way, my children stopped seeing the value in these connections. They stopped understanding that stories aren't just entertainment, they're instruction, wisdom, legacy passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. Jennifer works as a marketing executive for a tech company in downtown Los Angeles. She's 47 years old, drives a white BMW, and lives in a glass and steel condo in Century City with her second husband, Marcus, who's 15 years younger, and speaks mainly in business jargon about synergy and optimization. She visits me twice a month, usually on Sunday afternoons, bringing expensive pastries from some trendy bakery and staying exactly 90 minutes before announcing she has to leave for a dinner reservation or an early morning meeting. During these visits, she sits on the edge of my sofa like she's afraid of settling in too comfortably, checking her phone every few minutes and responding to texts with urgent efficiency. When I try to share news about the neighborhood or ask about her work, she gives me abbreviated answers while scrolling through emails. "Work's fine, Mom. Just busy. You know how it is." But I don't know how it is, because she never tells me. When I mention that I saw her old friend Carol at the grocery store, she sighs and says, "Mom, I haven't talked to Carol in 15 years. Why do you always bring up people from the past?" When I try to tell her about the historical society's new exhibit on local World War II veterans, she nods absently and makes vague humming sounds that indicate she's listening without actually hearing. David is 44 and works as an accountant for a firm in Burbank. He's married to Rebecca, who teaches high school English and has strong opinions about everything from organic vegetables to standardized testing. They live in a 4-bedroom house in Glendale with their 2 teenagers, Emma and Tyler, who are 15 and 17 respectively. David visits more often than Jennifer, usually stopping by on Saturday mornings to check on the house and make sure I'm managing okay. He walks through the rooms with a contractor's eye, noting loose tiles and squeaky hinges, suggesting I consider hiring someone to help with yard work or that maybe it's time to think about downsizing to something more manageable. Rebecca always accompanies him, armed with helpful suggestions about meal planning and gentle recommendations for senior community centers where I might make friends with people your own age. She speaks to me in the tone reserved for elderly relatives and small children, slightly louder than necessary and with exaggerated patience. When I mention current events or share opinions about local politics, she smiles indulgently and changes the subject to safer topics like the weather or my garden. She has a way of dismissing my thoughts without directly contradicting them, simply by redirecting the conversation elsewhere, as if my ideas aren't substantial enough to warrant serious discussion. The grandchildren, Emma and Tyler, are polite but distant. They hug me dutifully when they arrive and leave, answer direct questions with minimal responses, and spend most of their time during visits looking at their phones or making subtle faces at each other when they think I'm not watching. Emma is academically gifted and plans to study pre-med at UCLA. Tyler plays baseball and works part-time at a smoothie shop. They're good kids, but I can see in their eyes that they view me as an artifact from a previous era, someone whose experiences and perspectives have little relevance to their modern lives. When I try to tell them stories about their grandfather, whom they never met, they listen with the kind of forced attention children display during school assemblies. When I share memories of their parents as young children, they exchange glances that suggest they've heard these tales too many times already. When I attempt to connect my own adolescence during the 1960s to their current experiences, they look at me as if I'm speaking a foreign language. To them, I'm not a woman who lived through the civil rights movement, who watched the moon landing on a black and white television, who raised 2 children as a single mother while working full-time as a secretary for the school district. I'm just grandma, who repeats herself and doesn't understand how different things are now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The pattern had been building for months, maybe years, but I didn't recognize it fully until that particular Sunday in October when the whole family gathered at my house for Jennifer's birthday dinner. I had spent the entire day preparing Robert's famous lasagna recipe, the one that used to make the children beg for seconds and thirds. I set the table with my good china, the spode pattern with the blue flowers that we received as a wedding gift and only used for special occasions. I arranged fresh flowers from the garden in the crystal vase that had belonged to my grandmother, and I lit the tall white candles that cast a warm glow over the dining room. I was excited to have everyone together under one roof, something that happened less and less frequently as the years passed. I had stories to share about the new family that moved into the Hendersons' old house, updates about the church's fundraising campaign for the children's playground, news about my bridge partner Dolores, whose grandson had just graduated from medical school. I wanted to hear about Tyler's baseball season, Emma's college applications, Jennifer's latest projects at work, David and Rebecca's plans for their upcoming anniversary. But as the evening progressed, I began to notice something troubling. Every time I started to share a story or piece of news, someone would interrupt or redirect the conversation. When I mentioned that the new neighbors had asked about the history of the house, David cut in to suggest I should be more careful about strangers asking personal questions. When I tried to tell them about the Historical Society's upcoming lecture on California architecture, Rebecca began discussing Tyler's need to study for his SATs. When I brought up the article I'd read about the city's plan to renovate the downtown library, Jennifer immediately launched into a complaint about her commute time. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, the natural flow of conversation among family members eager to catch up with each other. But as the evening wore on, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Not only were they consistently changing the subject when I spoke, but they began making comments about my tendency to repeat stories and dwell on the past. When I mentioned that I'd already told them about the new neighbors, Jennifer sighed and said, "Yes, Mom, you mentioned them when I called on Tuesday." When I brought up the library renovation again, forgetting I'd mentioned it earlier, David said, "We know, Mom. You told us about that already." The breaking point came when I tried to share a memory about Robert's last birthday, which would have been his 74th if he were still alive. I wanted to tell them about the special dinner I'd cooked that night, how happy he'd been about the vintage baseball cards I'd found for his collection, how he'd said it was one of the best birthdays he'd ever had. But before I could finish the story, Jennifer held up her hand like a traffic cop and said, "Mom, we've heard this story so many times. Can we please talk about something else?" The room fell silent in a way that felt heavy and uncomfortable. Tyler cleared his throat and asked if anyone wanted more bread. Emma suddenly became very interested in rearranging the food on her plate. David and Rebecca exchanged one of their meaningful looks, the kind that conveyed an entire conversation without words. I sat there feeling as if I'd been slapped, not by the interruption itself, but by the casual dismissal of something that mattered deeply to me. After dinner, while I was washing dishes in the kitchen, I overheard a conversation from the living room that made my hands freeze in the sudsy water. Rebecca was speaking in a low voice to David and Jennifer, but the house's acoustics carried her words clearly to where I stood. "I think we need to have a conversation about your mother's memory," she said. "She's definitely repeating herself more often. She told me the same story about the neighbors 3 times today." Jennifer's response made my chest tighten. "I've noticed it too. She keeps bringing up Dad and telling the same old stories about the neighborhood. It's like she's stuck in the past." David's voice was gentler but equally concerning. "Maybe we should suggest she see someone. There are tests they can do to check for cognitive decline." I stood at the sink, my hands submerged in cooling water, listening to my own children discuss my mental capacity as if I were already incapacitated. They weren't just dismissing my stories anymore, they were interpreting my desire to share memories and maintain connections as a sign of failing mental health. The woman who had balanced a checkbook for 50 years, who still did the Los Angeles Times crossword puzzle in ink every morning, who could remember the birthdays of 37 different family members and friends without writing them down, was being written off as confused and repetitive. That night, after everyone had left and the house returned to its usual quiet, I sat in Robert's old chair in the living room and really thought about what had happened. I wasn't repeating stories because I was confused or forgetful. I was repeating them because they mattered, because they connected us to something larger than ourselves, because they preserved the essence of who we were as a family. But my children no longer saw value in these connections. They had become so focused on moving forward, on managing their busy lives and achieving their goals, that they'd lost appreciation for the foundation that made their progress possible. I realized that evening that my family didn't just find my stories annoying, they found me annoying. I had become, in their eyes, a burden to be managed rather than a person to be valued. They visited out of duty, not desire. They listened out of politeness, not interest. They had reduced me to a collection of eccentricities and inconveniences, a sweet but dotty old woman who couldn't understand that times had changed. But I understood more than they knew. I understood that their impatience with my stories reflected their disconnection from their own history. I understood that their discomfort with my memories revealed their anxiety about aging and mortality. I understood that their need to control and redirect our conversations stemmed from their inability to see me as anything other than their increasingly fragile mother, rather than the complex, intelligent woman I had always been. Most importantly, I understood that I had choices to make about how to respond to this situation. I could continue accepting their dismissal, allowing them to minimize my voice and my value. I could retreat into the quiet loneliness they seemed to prefer, speaking only when spoken to and keeping my stories to myself. Or I could find a way to remind them that Margaret Rose Fletcher was still very much in control of her own life, still capable of making decisions that demanded attention and respect. That's when I began to think about my will, and how I might use it to teach my family a lesson they would never forget about the power of repetition. The first small test came 3 weeks after that uncomfortable birthday dinner. I had been thinking carefully about how to approach this situation, and I decided to start with something subtle, something that would gauge their reactions without revealing my larger plan. During our regular Sunday afternoon gathering, I casually mentioned that I had scheduled an appointment with my attorney, Harold Whitman, to review some estate planning documents. Jennifer barely looked up from her phone when I made this announcement. "That's good, Mom. It's smart to keep those things updated." Her tone was distracted, the same voice she might use to acknowledge that I'd mentioned picking up groceries or getting the oil changed in my car. David nodded approvingly, as if I'd finally done something sensible for once. "Have you thought about simplifying things? Maybe setting up a trust or something more straightforward?" Rebecca immediately chimed in with her helpful suggestions. About making sure all the paperwork was organized and easily accessible, speaking to me like I was a child who needed guidance managing my crayons. But I noticed something interesting in their casual responses. Despite their apparent disinterest, each of them found a reason to call me within the next few days. Jennifer phoned on Tuesday evening, ostensibly to check on how I was feeling after catching a minor cold, but the conversation quickly shifted to questions about what exactly I was updating with Harold. David stopped by on Thursday morning, claiming he wanted to check the gutters after the recent rain, but he lingered in the kitchen asking whether I needed any help organizing important papers. Rebecca sent a thoughtful text message about a senior services workshop on estate planning, followed by a phone call offering to accompany me to any appointments if I needed support. Their sudden attention was revealing. These were the same people who had been dismissing my stories and treating my thoughts as repetitive nonsense, but the moment I mentioned making changes to legal documents that would affect their inheritance, they became very interested in my mental state and decision-making capacity. I found this shift both amusing and deeply troubling. They had no patience for my memories of their father or my observations about the neighborhood, but they had plenty of time to discuss my estate planning. The appointment with Harold went exactly as I had expected. He's been my attorney for 15 years, ever since old Mr. Patterson retired, and he knows me well enough to understand that I don't make impulsive decisions. Harold is a methodical man in his early 60s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, who speaks in careful, measured sentences and takes detailed notes in a leather-bound notebook. His office is located in a restored Victorian house in Old Town Pasadena, with dark wood paneling and tall bookshelves filled with legal volumes. The atmosphere is serious but comfortable, the kind of place where important decisions are made with proper consideration. When I explained my situation to Harold, he listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small notations in his notebook. I told him about the family dinner, about the conversation I'd overheard regarding my supposed cognitive decline, about the pattern of dismissal and redirection that had been building for months. I explained that I wanted to make some strategic changes to my will, not out of spite or anger, but as a way to communicate something important to my family about respect and attention. Harold leaned back in his leather chair and removed his glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully before responding. Margaret, I've known you for a long time, and I've never questioned your mental acuity or judgment. However, what you're proposing is unusual, and I want to make sure you've considered all the implications. We spent the next hour discussing various approaches, examining the legal ramifications of different strategies, and ensuring that whatever actions I took would be completely defensible if challenged. By the end of our meeting, we had developed a plan that was both legally sound and psychologically effective. The first change would be relatively minor, something that would get their attention without causing major alarm. I would remove Jennifer's children, Emma and Tyler, as beneficiaries of a small education fund I had established years earlier, and instead designate that money for a scholarship program at the local community college. The fund contained about $15,000, not enough to significantly impact anyone's financial future, but enough to make a point. The second change would be more substantial. I would alter the distribution of my house, which was by far the most valuable asset in my estate. Instead of leaving it jointly to Jennifer and David as originally planned, I would designate it to be sold, with the proceeds going to the Pasadena Historical Society and the local library system. This change would cost my children approximately $400,000, split between them, but it would ensure that my home would contribute to preserving the kind of community history and resources that they seem to find so meaningless. Harold prepared the necessary documents with his usual precision, and I signed them on a rainy Thursday afternoon in November. As I wrote my name on each page, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and satisfaction. Sadness because I was acknowledging that my relationship with my children had deteriorated to the point where legal maneuvers were necessary to get their attention. Satisfaction because I was finally taking action to address a problem that had been eating away at me for months. The plan was to let them know about these changes gradually, watching their reactions and gauging whether they were capable of recognizing what was happening and why. I decided to start with David, since he was generally more thoughtful and less reactive than Jennifer. The following Saturday, when he came by for his weekly check on the house, I mentioned casually that I had made some updates to my estate planning. "What kind of updates?" he asked, his attention suddenly sharper than it had been moments before when I was telling him about the new family that had moved into the old Morrison place. "Well, I've been thinking about the education fund I set up for Emma and Tyler," I said, watching his face carefully. "I've decided to redirect that money toward a scholarship program instead. There are so many young people in the community who need help with college expenses." David's reaction was immediate and telling. His expression shifted from casual interest to concerned attention, and he set down the coffee cup he'd been holding. "Mom, that's a pretty significant decision. Have you talked to Jennifer about this? Have you thought about how the kids will feel?" I found his response fascinating. Here was a man who couldn't be bothered to listen when I talked about community events or neighborhood changes, but the moment I mentioned redirecting money away from his niece and nephew, he was suddenly very concerned about communication and feelings. "I've thought about it quite a bit," I replied calmly. "I believe the money will do more good helping multiple students rather than just two who already have significant family support." "But Mom, that fund was specifically set up for Emma and Tyler. They've been counting on it for college planning." David's voice carried a note of urgency that I rarely heard when we discussed other topics. "Have they?" I asked gently. "Because I've tried to talk to them about college and future plans many times, and they never seem very interested in having those conversations with me. They don't ask about the fund, they don't discuss their academic goals with me, and they certainly don't seem to value the kind of educational experiences I try to share with them." David was quiet for a moment, processing my words. I could see him beginning to understand that this wasn't just a random change of heart, but a response to something deeper. Are you upset about something, Mom? Is this about the birthday dinner? His question showed that he was at least perceptive enough to connect recent events, but I wasn't ready to reveal the full scope of my plan yet. I'm not upset, David. I'm simply making decisions about my estate that reflect my current values and observations. I want my money to go where it will be most appreciated and put to best use. That evening, David called Jennifer, and I knew. This because Jennifer called me within an hour, her voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. Mom, David told me you're making changes to the kids' education fund. I think we need to talk about this. We can certainly talk, I replied, though I notice you're suddenly very interested in having a conversation with me. That's refreshing. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What do you mean by that? I mean that you haven't seemed particularly interested in my thoughts or opinions lately. But now that I'm making financial decisions, you want to have a discussion. I find that interesting. Jennifer's voice became more measured, the tone she probably used in business negotiations. Mom, making major estate changes without discussing them with family is concerning. We're worried about you. You're worried about the money, I corrected. If you were worried about me, you would have noticed that I've been trying to have meaningful conversations with all of you for months, and you've been dismissing everything I say as repetitive nonsense. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Jennifer alternating between attempts at manipulation and genuine confusion about what was happening. She couldn't understand why I was suddenly acting out, when I had been so reasonable and predictable for so long. She suggested that perhaps I was going through some kind of adjustment period, maybe dealing with depression or anxiety that was affecting my judgment. What she couldn't see, and what I wasn't ready to explain yet, was that my judgment had never been clearer. I was simply applying the same logical thinking that had guided me through decades of successful decision-making to a problem that required a creative solution. My family had trained themselves not to listen to my words, so I was going to communicate through actions they couldn't ignore. The following week brought a flurry of attention that would have been gratifying if it hadn't been so transparently motivated by self-interest. Jennifer suggested we have lunch together, just the two of us, something she hadn't proposed in over a year. David offered to help me organize my important papers, a task he'd never shown interest in before. Rebecca sent me information about support groups for widows, along with gentle suggestions about the importance of not making major decisions during times of emotional stress. Even the grandchildren suddenly became more attentive. Emma called to ask about my garden, a topic she'd never shown curiosity about previously. Tyler offered to help with yard work, despite having consistently declined similar requests for the past several years. Their sudden interest in spending time with me was both heartening and heartbreaking. It proved that they were capable of being thoughtful and engaged when they chose to be, but it also confirmed that their previous indifference had been a choice rather than simply the natural distraction of busy lives. During my lunch with Jennifer, she spent considerable time expressing concern about my well-being and asking probing questions about my daily routine, my social activities, and my overall happiness. She wanted to know if I was feeling lonely, if I was having trouble managing the house, if I was experiencing any health issues that might be affecting my thinking. Her questions were thorough and seemed caring, but I recognized them as a diagnostic interview designed to assess my mental competency. Mom, I want you to know that we love you and we're here to support you through whatever you're going through, she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand in a gesture that felt more patronizing than comforting. But we're concerned that you might be making decisions based on emotions rather than clear thinking. I looked at her directly, this accomplished woman who managed million-dollar marketing campaigns and supervised teams of creative professionals, and I saw someone who genuinely believed that her 73-year-old mother had suddenly become incapable of rational thought. Jennifer, let me ask you something. Do you think I've shown signs of mental decline in other areas of my life? Am I having trouble managing my finances, maintaining my home, or taking care of myself? She hesitated, clearly recognizing the trap in the question. No, you seem to be managing everything else fine. It's just these sudden changes to your estate planning that have us worried. So you believe I'm competent to live independently, drive a car, manage my investments, and make decisions about my healthcare, but I'm not competent to decide how to distribute my own money after I die. Jennifer's discomfort was visible. She understood that her position didn't make logical sense, but she was struggling to articulate what was really bothering her. It's not about competency, Mom. It's about communication. We feel like you're shutting us out, making decisions that affect the whole family without including us in the process. Her choice of words was revealing. She was upset about being shut out of decisions that affected the family, but she'd been shutting me out of conversations and dismissing my input for months. She wanted communication when it involved money and inheritance, but she had no patience for communication about memories, values, or relationships. I decided to push a little harder. When was the last time you asked me what I thought about something important? When was the last time you seemed interested in my opinions or experiences? Jennifer looked genuinely puzzled by the question. We talk all the time, Mom. No, you talk and I listen. Or rather, you talk and I pretend to listen while you make it clear that my contributions to the conversation are unwelcome digressions from more important topics. I kept my voice calm and factual, not wanting to sound emotional or unstable. You've trained me to be quiet and agreeable, and now you're surprised that I'm taking action instead of asking for permission. The lunch ended with Jennifer promising to work on communication and asking me to promise not to make any more significant changes without discussing them first. I agreed to consider her request, knowing that I had already made the second round of changes the day before our lunch meeting. That evening, I sat in my garden as the sun set behind the mountains, thinking about how strange it felt to be strategically managing my own family relationships like a complex business negotiation. I had never wanted to be the kind of mother who used money as a weapon or who played games with inheritance to control her children's behavior. But I had also never imagined that I would need to fight for basic respect and attention from people I had devoted my life to raising and supporting. The reality was that my family had become comfortable with a dynamic where my role was to be quietly supportive and gratefully accepting of whatever attention they chose to give me. They expected me to be satisfied with brief visits, surface-level conversations, and the assumption that I would continue to be a reliable source of emotional and financial support regardless of how they treated me. By changing my will, I wasn't trying to hurt them or punish them, though I understood that the financial impact would certainly get their attention. I was trying to reset the balance of power in our relationships, to remind them that respect and consideration should flow both ways, and to demonstrate that their assumption of control over our family dynamics was just that, an assumption, not a reality. As I watered the roses that evening, I thought about Robert and what he would think of my strategy. He had always been the more diplomatic parent, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found gentle ways to guide the children toward better behavior. But Robert had also been a man who commanded natural respect, whose opinions were sought and valued, whose presence was genuinely wanted rather than simply tolerated. I missed having a partner who could help me navigate these complex family dynamics, someone who could provide perspective and support as I tried to find the right balance between standing up for myself and maintaining loving relationships with my children. But I also knew that Robert would understand what I was trying to accomplish. He would see that I wasn't acting out of petty revenge, but out of a deep need to restore dignity and mutual respect to our family relationships. The second change to my will would soon become apparent, and I was curious to see how my family would respond when they realized that this wasn't just about a relatively small education fund, but about something much more significant. I was also beginning to plan the third change, the one that would complete my lesson and hopefully open their eyes to what they had been doing to me, and to themselves, for far too long. The revelation about the house came on a gray December morning when I received an unexpected visitor. Harold Whitman had called the evening before to let me know that David had contacted his office, requesting a meeting to discuss my estate planning decisions. I wasn't surprised by this development, but I was curious about the approach David would take. Would he try to have me declared incompetent? Would he attempt to manipulate Harold into revealing confidential information? Or would he finally recognize that he needed to address the underlying issues in our relationship? I was sitting in my kitchen, enjoying my morning tea and working on the crossword puzzle, when David arrived at my front door. He didn't use his key, which he'd had for years, but instead knocked politely and waited for me to answer. This small gesture told me immediately that something fundamental had shifted in his perception of our relationship. He was no longer assuming automatic access to my space or presuming that he could simply walk into my life whenever it suited him. "Good morning, Mom," he said when I opened the door. His face was serious, almost formal, and he carried a manila folder under his arm. I was wondering if we could talk. I've learned some things that I think we need to discuss. I invited him in and offered coffee, which he accepted gratefully. We sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared countless conversations over the years, but the atmosphere felt different now, charged with unspoken tensions and careful politeness. David placed the folder on the table between us but didn't open it immediately. "I had a meeting with Harold yesterday," he began, his voice measured and controlled. "He couldn't give me specific details about your new will, of course, but he was able to confirm that you've made significant changes beyond the education fund. Mom, I need to ask you directly, are you planning to disinherit Jennifer and me?" His question was fair and straightforward, and I appreciated that he was approaching this conversation with directness rather than manipulation. I'm not disinheriting you, I replied honestly. But I am redistributing some assets in ways that reflect my current priorities and values. David opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. I could see that he had been doing research, gathering information about estate planning strategies and legal precedents. I've been reading about estate planning, and I understand that you have every right to dispose of your assets however you choose. What I don't understand is why you've chosen to do this without talking to us first. When was the last time you wanted to talk to me about something I cared about? I asked, echoing the question I'd posed to Jennifer weeks earlier. When was the last time you seemed interested in my thoughts or opinions about anything? David was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking about my question more seriously than Jennifer had. I guess I don't understand what you mean. We talk every week when I come over. No, David. You check on me every week. You walk through the house looking for maintenance issues, you ask if I need help with errands, and you listen politely while I try to share news or memories. But you don't engage with what I'm actually saying. You don't ask follow-up questions, you don't show genuine interest, and you certainly don't value my perspective on anything important. I watched as he processed this feedback, seeing the recognition slowly dawn in his eyes. Are you saying that you've changed your will because you feel like we don't listen to you? I'm saying that I've changed my will because I realize that the only time any of you pay attention to me is when money is involved. You dismiss my stories as repetitive rambling, you redirect conversations away from topics I find meaningful, and you've convinced yourselves that I'm becoming mentally incompetent because I continue to value things you consider outdated or irrelevant. David leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was struggling with difficult homework problems. Mom, I had no idea you felt this way. I thought we had a good relationship. We have a functional relationship, I corrected. You fulfill your obligations as a dutiful son, and I fulfill my role as a grateful mother who doesn't make demands or cause trouble. But we don't have the kind of relationship where my thoughts and feelings matter to you beyond their impact on your convenience and comfort. I could see that my words were affecting him more deeply than I had expected. David had always been the more sensitive of my two children, more prone to introspection and self-doubt. Jennifer was confident and decisive, sometimes to a fault, while David was thoughtful and analytical, always wanting to understand the full picture before making judgments. Can you give me specific examples? He asked quietly. I want to understand what I've been doing wrong. His willingness to ask for concrete feedback surprised me. I had expected him to become defensive or to minimize my concerns, but instead he seemed genuinely interested in learning about my perspective. I spent the next 30 minutes describing specific incidents where I had felt dismissed or ignored, moments when my attempts at conversation had been redirected or cut short, times when my opinions had been politely acknowledged but clearly not valued. I told him about the afternoon when I'd tried to share an article about urban development that reminded me of changes I'd witnessed in Pasadena over the decades, and how he'd responded by suggesting I might enjoy a senior center discussion group where I could talk about such things with people who share my interests. I described the evening when I'd attempted to tell a story about his father's approach to handling difficult situations, hoping to offer guidance during a challenging time at his job, and how he'd thanked me for the advice while clearly having no intention of considering it seriously. I explained how it felt to watch my grandchildren exchange glances when I spoke, to see my own children's attention drift when I tried to share memories or observations, to realize that my presence at family gatherings was tolerated rather than welcomed. I talked about the loneliness of having so much life experience and wisdom to share, but no one who seemed interested in receiving it. David listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making notes on one of his papers. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes, staring out the kitchen window at the garden where he used to play as a child. I never realized, he said finally. I thought I was being supportive by not arguing with you or challenging your opinions. I thought I was being respectful by not overwhelming you with my problems or expecting you to solve my issues. But David, I want to be involved in solving your problems. I want you to challenge my opinions and engage with my ideas. I want to feel like I'm still a valuable contributor to this family, not just a beloved burden who needs to be managed carefully. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a young man, vulnerable and uncertain but willing to be honest about his confusion. Mom, how do I fix this? How do we fix this? His question gave me hope, but I also knew that real change would require more than good intentions and temporary adjustments. David, I appreciate that you're willing to have this conversation. And I can see that you're genuinely trying to understand my perspective. But I need to know that this isn't just a reaction to discovering that your inheritance might be affected. I need to know that you value me as a person, not just as your mother who holds the keys to the family assets. How can I prove that to you? He asked. By showing sustained interest in my thoughts and experiences, not just during crisis conversations like this one. By asking my opinion about things that matter to you, and actually considering my responses. By defending my right to speak when other family members try to dismiss or redirect me. By treating me like an intelligent adult whose perspective has value, rather than a fragile elderly woman who needs to be humored and protected. David nodded slowly, and I could see him making mental notes about specific behaviors he wanted to change. What about the will changes, Mom? Are you planning to change things back if we improve how we treat you? His question revealed that he still didn't fully understand what I was trying to accomplish. David, this isn't a negotiation or a punishment system. I'm not holding my inheritance hostage to force better behavior. I'm making decisions about my estate based on my values and priorities, and right now, those priorities include supporting organizations and causes that demonstrate the kind of respect and appreciation I'm not receiving from my family. But if things improve between us, might you reconsider some of these changes? I might, I admitted. But only if I see genuine, sustained change in how you and Jennifer and the grandchildren relate to me. And only if those changes come from a real shift in how you value me as a person, not from a desire to protect your financial interests. We talked for another hour, with David asking thoughtful questions about specific incidents and relationship patterns. He wanted to understand not just what he had done wrong, but why it had been hurtful and how he could do better going forward. His approach was methodical and sincere, and I began to feel cautiously optimistic that he might be capable of real change. But even as we talked, I knew that David was only one part of the equation. Jennifer's reaction to learning about the house would be very different, and I suspected it would reveal aspects of our relationship that were even more troubling than what I'd experienced with David. That evening, David called Jennifer to share what he had learned, and by 9 o'clock my phone was ringing with her distinctive ringtone. I let it go to voicemail, not because I was avoiding the conversation, but because I wanted to choose the time and setting for what I knew would be a difficult discussion. Jennifer's voicemail message was brief but telling. Mom, David told me about the house. We need to talk immediately. This is serious, and I think you need professional help. Call me back tonight. Her tone was sharp and commanding, the voice she probably used with subordinates who had made unacceptable mistakes. There was no acknowledgement that I might have valid reasons for my decisions, no curiosity about my perspective, and no respect for my right to make choices about my own property. Instead, there was an immediate jump to the conclusion that I needed professional intervention, as if any decision that inconvenienced her was by definition evidence of mental incompetence. I didn't call her back that night. Instead, I spent the evening in my garden, even though it was cold and most of the plants were dormant for winter. I sat on the old wooden bench that Robert had built decades ago, wrapped in a heavy coat and listening to the distant sounds of the city. I thought about the house that had caused such alarm, this place where I had raised my children and built a life with my husband. The house wasn't just a financial asset to me. It was a repository of memories, a testament to decades of careful maintenance and gradual improvements, a symbol of everything I had worked to create and preserve. Every room held stories that my children no longer seemed interested in hearing. The kitchen where Robert had taught them to make pancakes, the living room where we'd opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays, the backyard where they'd played and learned to ride bicycles and hosted graduation parties. But I also understood that to Jennifer and David, the house represented financial security and inheritance expectations rather than emotional connection and family history. They had moved on to their own homes and their own lives, and they saw my house primarily as an asset they would eventually inherit and probably sell. My decision to redirect that inheritance toward organizations that would preserve community history and educational resources felt like theft to them, even though the house and everything in it belonged entirely to me. The next morning, Jennifer arrived unannounced at 8:30, clearly having taken time off from work to address what she saw as a family crisis. She didn't knock or ring the doorbell but used her key to enter, calling out "Mom" as she walked through the front door. I was in the kitchen, finishing my breakfast and reading the newspaper, and I didn't get up to greet her. "There you are," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and irritation. "Why didn't you return my call last night?" "I was worried. Sick." "I was here, safe and sound, just as I am every night," I replied calmly. "I chose not to call you back because your message suggested that you wanted to have a conversation about my mental health rather than my estate planning decisions, and I wasn't interested in that particular discussion." Jennifer sat down across from me at the kitchen table, pulling out her phone and placing it face down between us. "Mom, we need to talk about what's happening here. David told me that you've made major changes to your will, including leaving the house to charity instead of to your children. This is not normal behavior. What's not normal about an elderly woman deciding how to distribute her assets after death?" I asked. What's not normal is making these decisions suddenly, without family input, and in ways that seem designed to hurt the people who love you most. Jennifer's voice was rising, and I could see her struggling to maintain the professional composure she usually relied on in difficult situations. Jennifer, nothing about these decisions has been sudden. I've been thinking about my values and priorities for months, observing how our family interactions have evolved, and making careful choices about how to align my estate planning with my current understanding of what matters most. But Mom, you're talking about giving away hundreds of thousands of dollars that should go to your family. Money that could help Emma and Tyler with college, that could support David and Rebecca's retirement planning, that could give me financial security in an uncertain economy. Her focus on the financial impact confirmed everything I had suspected about her motivations. Jennifer, when have you ever seemed concerned about my financial security or my need for support? When have you asked about my retirement planning or my healthcare costs or my ability to maintain this house as I age? She looked genuinely confused by my questions. You've never indicated that you needed financial help. You've always seemed to manage everything fine on your own. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking when you've shown interest in my financial well-being as something that matters to you, rather than just assuming that I'll continue to be self-sufficient until I die and then leave you whatever remains. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling to understand the distinction I was making. I don't understand what you want from me, Mom. I've never asked you for money or pressured you to support me financially. But you've also never asked if I need support, never shown curiosity about my expenses or concerns, never treated my financial situation as something that affects our relationship beyond its impact on your eventual inheritance. I kept my voice level and factual, not wanting to sound accusatory even though I was pointing out uncomfortable truths. Are you saying that you've changed your will because you want us to give you money? Jennifer's tone suggested that she found this possibility both surprising and somehow inappropriate. I'm saying that I've changed my will because I want you to see me as a whole person whose thoughts, feelings, and experiences matter, not just as a source of future financial benefit who should be managed carefully until that benefit can be collected. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Jennifer alternating between attempts to understand my perspective and efforts to convince me that I was making a mistake. She suggested that I might be experiencing depression or anxiety related to aging and loss. She offered to help me find a therapist who specialized in geriatric issues. She proposed that we could establish a family meeting schedule where everyone would commit to better communication. But throughout all of her suggestions and concerns, I noticed that Jennifer never actually asked me what I wanted or what would make me feel more valued and respected. She was focused entirely on finding ways to change my behavior and reverse my decisions, rather than examining whether my complaints about our family dynamics might be valid. As she prepared to leave, Jennifer made one final attempt at persuasion. Mom, I want you to know that I love you and I'm grateful for everything you've done for our family. But I also think you need to understand that these changes are going to hurt people who don't deserve to be hurt. Emma and Tyler have done nothing wrong, and neither have David and Rebecca. You're right, I agreed. Emma and Tyler have done nothing wrong except learn from the adults around them that it's acceptable to treat elderly family members with polite indifference. David and Rebecca have done nothing wrong except assume that their convenience and comfort should take priority over my need for genuine connection and respect. Jennifer's face showed frustration and something that might have been genuine hurt. What do you want us to do, Mom? How do we fix this? Her question echoed David's from the day before, but her tone was different. Where David had seemed genuinely curious about my perspective, Jennifer sounded like someone trying to solve a problem that was interfering with her plans. I realized that she was asking how to fix the situation, not how to fix our relationship. Jennifer, I want you to start by acknowledging that the problem isn't my mental health or my decision-making capacity. The problem is that somewhere along the way, our family stopped treating me like a person whose thoughts and feelings matter. You've all become comfortable with a dynamic where I exist primarily to be supportive and accommodating, and where my own needs for intellectual engagement and emotional connection are seen as unreasonable demands. But we do value you, Mom. We love you. I believe that you love me, I replied. But I don't believe that you value me. Love and value are different things. You love me as your mother, as the person who raised you and sacrificed for you and will always be there to support you. But you don't value me as an individual with insights and experiences that could enrich your lives, as someone whose opinions deserve serious consideration, as a person whose company you genuinely enjoy rather than simply tolerate. Jennifer left that afternoon without resolution, promising to think about what I had said but also making it clear that she considered my decisions to be harmful and potentially reversible if I would just be reasonable about the situation. I watched her drive away in her expensive car, returning to her busy life and her important job, and I wondered if she would ever be capable of seeing me as anything other than a problem to be solved or a resource to be managed. That evening, I called Harold to discuss the third and final change to my will. This one would be the most significant, both financially and symbolically, and I wanted to make sure that it was structured in a way that would clearly communicate my message while remaining legally unassailable. The third change would involve my investment accounts and personal savings, approximately $250,000 that represented a lifetime of careful financial planning and conservative investment strategies. Instead of leaving this money to Jennifer and David, I would establish a foundation dedicated to supporting programs that connected young people with elderly community members, facilitating intergenerational relationships based on mutual respect and genuine interest. The foundation would fund initiatives like oral history projects where teenagers interviewed seniors about their life experiences, mentorship programs that paired elderly experts with young people starting careers, and community gardens where different generations worked together to create something beautiful and useful. It would support exactly the kind of meaningful intergenerational connection that seemed to be missing from my own family relationships. As I explained my vision to Harold, I felt a sense of purpose and clarity that had been missing from my life. For months, these changes to my will weren't just about teaching my family a lesson or protecting myself from further dismissal and disrespect. They were about ensuring that my life's work and accumulated resources would continue to promote the values I believed in, even after I was no longer around to advocate for them myself. The foundation would be my legacy, a lasting testament to the importance of listening to each other across generational lines, of valuing wisdom and experience, of creating communities where every voice mattered regardless of age. It would be everything I had tried and failed to create within my own family, extended to touch the lives of people I would never meet but who might benefit from the lessons I had learned through my own disappointments and discoveries. As I signed the final documents that evening, I thought about Robert and what he would think of the path I had chosen. I believed he would understand that I wasn't acting out of anger or revenge, but out of a deep desire to create something meaningful from the pain of being systematically ignored and dismissed by the people I loved most. The third change would soon become apparent to my family, and I was curious to see whether they would finally understand what I had been trying to tell them, or whether they would simply view it as further evidence that I needed to be stopped before I could do any more damage to their expectations and plans. The storm arrived 3 days after I signed the final documents establishing the foundation. Not a weather storm, but the kind of family crisis that builds slowly and then explodes with devastating force. Harold had sent copies of the updated will to both Jennifer and David, as I had requested, along with a detailed explanation of the foundation's mission and structure. I wanted them to understand exactly what I had done and why, rather than learning about it piecemeal through fragments of conversation and speculation. Jennifer was the first to call, and her voice when she spoke my name was unlike anything I had ever heard from her before. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was certainly present. It was something closer to shock, the sound of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just been shattered. "Mom," she said, and then there was a long pause, as if she couldn't find words for what she needed to say next. "I received Harold's package," she continued finally. "I need to understand what you think you're accomplishing here. This isn't just about hurt feelings anymore. You're talking about dismantling our family's financial security, destroying the legacy that Dad worked so hard to build, punishing your own children for things they don't even understand they've done wrong." I had been expecting this conversation, but the intensity of Jennifer's distress still surprised me. "Jennifer, I'm not dismantling anything that your father built. I'm redirecting resources that I accumulated through my own choices and planning toward causes that reflect my values. Your father has been gone for 22 years. The money I'm redistributing comes from investments and savings I've managed entirely on my own since his death. But this was supposed to be our inheritance, Mom. This was supposed to provide security for Emma and Tyler, help David and Rebecca in their retirement, give me options as I get older. You're taking away our future to make some kind of point about respect and attention." Her words revealed everything I needed to know about how she viewed our relationship and my role in her life. The money wasn't just expected, it was considered already theirs, as if my death was simply a formality that would transfer predetermined assets according to an unspoken but binding family contract. "Jennifer, when did I promise you this inheritance? When did we have a conversation where I committed to leaving you and David my estate regardless of how our relationships evolved over time?" There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could imagine Jennifer struggling to formulate an answer that didn't sound completely self-serving. "It's not about promises, Mom. It's about normal family expectations. Children inherit from their parents. That's how families work." "Some children inherit from their parents," I corrected. "Children who maintain loving, respectful relationships with their parents, who show genuine care and concern for their well-being, who treat them as valued family members rather than obligations to be managed. But inheritance isn't automatic. Jennifer. It's not a right that you acquire simply by being born. Our conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, during which Jennifer cycled through every argument and emotional appeal she could devise. She accused me of being vindictive and cruel, of using money as a weapon to hurt people who loved me. She suggested that I was having some kind of breakdown related to grief and aging, that I needed professional help to work through whatever psychological issues were driving these irrational decisions. She even offered to arrange for family counseling sessions where we could work through our communication problems under professional guidance. But what she never did was acknowledge that my complaints about our family dynamics might be legitimate. She never asked what she could do differently or expressed genuine curiosity about my experience of feeling dismissed and disrespected. Even when facing the loss of hundreds of thousands of dollars, she remained focused on changing my behavior rather than examining her own. David's response was more measured but equally revealing. He arrived at my house the morning after receiving Harold's package, carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing the serious expression he usually reserved for difficult business meetings. He had clearly spent considerable time researching legal options for challenging my will, and he wanted to discuss his findings before taking any formal action. "Mom, I've been talking to my own attorney about your situation," he began, setting his folder on the kitchen table between us. "He says that sudden, dramatic changes to estate planning can sometimes be challenged if there's evidence of diminished capacity or undue influence. He thinks we might have grounds for a legal challenge." His words hit me like a physical blow. Not because I was surprised by the possibility, but because I was deeply hurt that David would consider such an approach. Of all my family members, he was the one I had hoped might understand what I was trying to accomplish. "David, are you telling me that you're planning to have me declared mentally incompetent in order to reverse my estate planning decisions?" "I'm telling you that I'm exploring all of our options," he replied, his voice careful and controlled. "Mom, you're talking about giving away over $500,000 to strangers while your own family struggles with college costs, mortgage payments, and retirement planning. That's not normal behavior for someone who has always been so focused on family financial security." "David, I've been focused on financial security my entire adult life. I've saved and invested and planned carefully so that I would have choices about how to use my resources. Now I'm making those choices, and you want to have me declared incompetent because you don't like my decisions." "It's not about liking or disliking your decisions, Mom. It's about protecting you from making choices that you might regret later, when you're thinking more clearly." His assumption that I wasn't thinking clearly was perhaps the most painful part of this entire experience. Here was my son, who had seen me manage complex financial decisions for decades, who knew that I balanced my checkbook to the penny every month and tracked my investments with meticulous attention to detail, suggesting that I was suddenly incapable of rational thought because I had chosen to prioritize different values than he expected. "David, let me ask you something. Do you believe that I'm competent to live independently, drive a car, manage my daily affairs, and make decisions about my health care?" "Yes, of course," he answered without hesitation. "Do you believe that I understand the financial implications of the changes I've made to my will?" "Yes, I think you understand the numbers involved." "Then on what basis would you argue that I lack the mental capacity to make these decisions? What evidence would you present to a court to demonstrate that I'm not competent to dispose of my own property as I see fit?" David was quiet for a long moment, clearly recognizing the logical inconsistency in his position. "I suppose we would argue that these decisions are so dramatically different from your historical patterns that they suggest some kind of cognitive or emotional impairment. In other words, you would argue that any choice I make that conflicts with your expectations must be evidence of mental incompetence? That's not fair, Mom. You're making it sound like we're being greedy or controlling. Aren't you?" I asked gently. "David, you're sitting at my kitchen table discussing legal strategies to override my autonomous decisions about my own property because those decisions don't benefit you financially. How is that not controlling behavior?" The conversation that followed was perhaps the most honest discussion David and I had ever had about power, expectations, and family relationships. He gradually acknowledged that his desire to challenge my will wasn't really about protecting me from poor decisions, but about protecting his family's financial interests and his own assumptions about inheritance and family obligations. "I guess I always just assumed that you would leave everything to Jennifer and me," he admitted. "I never questioned whether we deserved it or whether you might have other priorities. I never thought about inheritance as something that needed to be earned through our behavior toward you. David, I don't want inheritance to be something you have to earn through good behavior, like children trying to please a strict parent. But I also don't want it to be something you can take for granted regardless of how you treat me. I want our relationship to be based on mutual respect and genuine care, and I want my estate planning to reflect those same values. So if we change how we interact with you, if we show more interest in your thoughts and experiences, would you consider changing the will back? His question showed that he still didn't fully understand what I was trying to accomplish. David, I'm not holding my inheritance hostage to force better behavior. I'm making decisions about my estate based on my current understanding of what matters most to me. If our relationships improve significantly and sustainably, I might reconsider some of these decisions. But any changes would have to come from a genuine shift in how you value me as a person, not from a strategic calculation about protecting your financial interests. Over the following weeks, I watched my family struggle to process what had happened and decide how to respond. Jennifer consulted with her own attorney about possible legal challenges, but apparently received advice similar to what David had gotten. It would be difficult to prove incompetence when I was clearly managing all other aspects of my life effectively. She also reached out to Rebecca and to my grandchildren, apparently hoping to build a coalition of family members who could testify about my changed behavior and concerning decisions. But the most interesting development was the sudden transformation in how my family members interacted with me. Jennifer began calling more frequently, ostensibly to check on my well-being but actually to engage in lengthy conversations about topics she had previously shown no interest in discussing. She asked about my volunteer work at the Historical Society, my bridge games, my garden, even my opinions about current events and local politics. Her questions seemed genuine, and she listened to my responses with apparent attention and interest. David started visiting more often, and during these visits he made deliberate efforts to engage with the stories and memories I had been trying to share for months. He asked about his father's work ethic and business philosophy, wanting to understand how Robert had approached challenges in his career. He requested details about their childhood that he had forgotten or never fully appreciated, and he seemed genuinely interested in understanding how our family's values and traditions had evolved over time. Even the grandchildren made noticeable changes in their behavior. Emma called to ask if I would help her with a school project about local history, and she spent an entire afternoon listening to my stories about Pasadena in the 1960s and 1970s. Tyler offered to help with yard work and actually seemed to enjoy hearing about the different plants and their care requirements while we worked together. Rebecca began including me in family planning discussions, asking for my input about holiday celebrations and vacation plans. She even solicited my advice about some challenges she was facing with difficult students, seeming to value my perspective based on my years of experience working in educational settings. The transformation was remarkable, and in many ways it gave me exactly what I had been longing for: genuine engagement, thoughtful attention, and respect for my knowledge and experience. But it was also deeply troubling, because I could see that these changes were motivated primarily by financial concerns rather than authentic shifts in how they valued me as a person. I found myself in the strange position of getting what I wanted while being unable to fully enjoy it because I knew it was essentially a performance designed to influence my estate planning decisions. My family members were finally listening to my stories and asking for my opinions, but their newfound interest felt calculated rather than genuine. They were treating me with the respect and attention I had craved, but only because they had learned that their inheritance depended on it. The situation came to a head during a family dinner in February, when Jennifer made what she clearly intended as a grand gesture of reconciliation and family unity. She had organized an elaborate celebration of what would have been Robert's 76th birthday, complete with his favorite foods, old photographs displayed throughout the house, and even a playlist of music he had enjoyed. The entire family was present, and everyone seemed committed to demonstrating their appreciation for family history and connection. During dinner, Jennifer made a toast that was clearly intended to signal a new beginning in our relationships. To Dad, who taught us the importance of family loyalty and love, and to Mom, who has carried on his legacy of wisdom and strength. We're grateful for everything you've given us, and we want you to know how much we value your guidance and your stories. The toast was followed by enthusiastic agreement from everyone present, and then by a coordinated effort to engage me in conversation about Robert's memory and our family history. David asked about Robert's approach to solving problems at work. Rebecca wanted to know about our courtship and early marriage. Emma and Tyler requested stories about their parents' childhoods that they claimed to have never heard before. It should have been a perfect evening, the kind of family gathering I had dreamed about during all those months of feeling dismissed and ignored. But instead of feeling satisfied and appreciated, I felt manipulated and reduced to a performance for people who were trying to earn their way back into my will through calculated displays of interest and respect. After everyone left that evening, I sat in Robert's old chair and thought about what had transpired. My family had learned how to give me what I thought I wanted, but in the process they had revealed that their previous indifference had been a choice rather than simply the natural result of busy lives and generational differences. They were capable of listening to my stories and valuing my opinions, they just hadn't seen any reason to do so until their inheritance was threatened. This realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating because it confirmed that my decisions about the will were justified and necessary. Heartbreaking because it meant that any future improvements in our relationships would always be shadowed by the knowledge that they had to be forced rather than arising naturally from love and respect. That night, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of being satisfied with the changes in my family's behavior, instead of considering whether to modify my will in response to their apparent transformation, I decided to accelerate my timeline and make the final arrangements for implementing my new estate plan immediately. I called Harold the next morning and asked him to begin the process of establishing the foundation and transferring the designated assets. I wanted to see my vision become reality while I was still alive to oversee its development, rather than leaving it as a posthumous surprise for my family to discover and potentially challenge. The foundation would be my living legacy, proof that I was still capable of creating something meaningful and lasting, still able to make decisions that reflected my deepest values regardless of how others might judge those choices. It would also serve as a final test of my family's newly demonstrated respect and attention, revealing whether their changed behavior could survive the knowledge that their performance had failed to achieve its intended purpose. The Foundation's first board meeting took place on a sunny morning in March, in the conference room of a small nonprofit organization that had agreed to provide administrative support during our startup phase. I sat at the head of a polished wooden table, surrounded by 5 individuals I had carefully selected for their expertise in education, community development, and intergenerational programming. Looking around the room at these dedicated professionals who shared my vision for connecting young and old in meaningful ways, I felt a sense of purpose and accomplishment that had been missing from my life for far too long. Dr. Sarah Chen, a gerontologist from USC who specialized in aging and community engagement, served as our board chair. Marcus Williams, a high school principal who had pioneered mentorship programs in underserved communities, brought practical experience in working with teenagers. Professor Elena Rodriguez from Pasadena City College contributed expertise in adult education and lifelong learning. James Morrison, a retired businessman who had spent his second career developing community gardens, understood the power of shared projects in building relationships across age groups. And Patricia Alvarez, a social worker who coordinated volunteer programs for seniors, knew firsthand how much older adults had to offer when given opportunities to share their knowledge and experience. As I explained the Foundation's mission and described the programs we hoped to fund, I watched these accomplished individuals respond with genuine enthusiasm and thoughtful questions. They understood immediately what I was trying to achieve, and they saw the potential for creating lasting change in how communities valued the contributions of their elderly members. Their engagement was everything my family's recent attention was not: authentic, voluntary, and focused on the substance of ideas rather than personal benefit. The contrast was sharp and telling. Here were strangers who had never known me as anything other than a woman with resources and vision, and they treated my ideas with respect and serious consideration. Meanwhile, my own children and grandchildren, who had known me their entire lives, had only recently discovered that my thoughts might be worth listening to, and only because their financial future depended on it. During the weeks following the board meeting, as we began developing specific programs and identifying partner organizations, I noticed that my family's newfound attention continued but with a slightly different tone. They seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted, that I was no longer simply the predictable mother and grandmother who could be counted on to maintain familiar patterns indefinitely. They were beginning to recognize that I had my own life, my own priorities, and my own capacity for independent action. Jennifer's approach became more respectful and less manipulative. Instead of trying to convince me that I was making mistakes, she began asking genuine questions about my motivations and goals. "Mom, help me understand what you're trying to accomplish with this foundation," she said during one of our conversations. "I can see that it's important to you, and I want to understand why." Her willingness to ask for understanding rather than demanding explanations was a significant improvement, and I found myself more willing to engage in substantive conversations about my values and vision. I told her about the loneliness of having wisdom and experience that no one seemed interested in receiving, about the frustration of watching younger generations reinvent solutions to problems that older generations had already solved, about the sadness of seeing families drift apart as their members became increasingly focused on their own immediate concerns. David's transformation was even more pronounced. He began visiting not just to check on practical matters, but to seek advice. about challenges he was facing at work and in his personal life. He asked about Robert's approach to balancing career ambitions with family responsibilities, and he seemed genuinely interested in learning from the experiences and insights I had accumulated over decades of managing similar challenges. "I realize. I've been treating you like you were fragile," he admitted during one of these conversations. "I thought I was being protective, but I can see now that I was actually being dismissive." "You're not fragile, Mom. You're probably stronger and more capable than any of us." His acknowledgement meant more to me than I had expected. For the first time in years, I felt like he was seeing me clearly rather than viewing me through the distorting lens of his own assumptions about aging and dependency. The grandchildren's changes were perhaps the most encouraging of all. Emma had become genuinely interested in family history and frequently called to ask about my childhood, my parents, and the social changes I had witnessed during my lifetime. She was working on a senior project about women's roles in the 1960s and 1970s, and she valued my first-hand accounts of navigating career and family during an era of rapid social change. Tyler had discovered that I possessed considerable knowledge about gardening, home maintenance, and practical life skills that weren't taught in school. He started spending Saturday mornings helping with yard work while learning about plant care, tool maintenance, and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful through patient, consistent effort. These interactions felt authentic in a way that the orchestrated family gatherings had not. The young people were seeking knowledge and perspective that they genuinely needed, and I was able to share expertise and wisdom that had real value in their lives. We were building relationships based on mutual benefit and respect rather than obligation and guilt. As spring progressed and the foundation began implementing its first programs, I found myself busier and more energized than I had been in years. We launched a oral history project that paired high school students with nursing home residents, creating documented interviews that preserved important community memories while giving young people direct access to the experiences and perspectives of their elders. We established mentorship programs that connected retired professionals with young people starting careers in similar fields. We funded intergenerational gardening projects where different age groups worked together to create community spaces that served the needs of all residents. Each program demonstrated the powerful positive effects that could result when different generations were brought together in structured, purposeful ways. The young people involved gained access to wisdom and guidance that enriched their understanding of themselves and their communities. The older participants experienced renewed sense of purpose and relevance, discovering that their knowledge and experience were still valuable and needed. But perhaps most importantly for me personally, these programs validated my belief that the dismissive treatment I had received from my own family was not an inevitable result of aging, but a choice that could be made differently. The foundations. Participants proved that meaningful intergenerational relationships were possible when both sides approached them with openness, respect, and genuine curiosity about what they could learn from each other. The final test of my family's transformation came in June, when I announced that I was planning to sell the house and move to a smaller condominium that would be easier to maintain as I aged. This decision was practical and well-reasoned, but it also meant that the house they had expected to inherit would no longer exist as a future asset, regardless of any changes I might make to my will. Jennifer's response surprised me with its thoughtfulness and support. "Mom, that makes sense. The house is too big for one person, and you'll be happier in a place that doesn't require so much maintenance. Do you want help looking at options? Or planning the move?" David offered to handle the logistics of selling and moving, treating it as a natural transition rather than a crisis to be prevented. "We can organize everything so it's as easy as possible for you, Mom. Just tell us what kind of place you're looking for and what neighborhood you prefer." Even Rebecca and the grandchildren responded positively, focusing on helping me find a living situation that would make me happy rather than mourning the loss of a potential inheritance. Their reactions confirmed that the changes in our relationships had evolved beyond calculated attempts to influence my estate planning. The move itself became an opportunity for genuine family bonding, as we sorted through decades of accumulated possessions and shared memories associated with different objects and photographs. Instead of viewing this process as preparation for my decline, everyone approached it as a celebration of my continued independence and forward-looking planning. I found a beautiful two-bedroom condominium in a complex designed for active seniors, with well-maintained common areas, organized social activities, and easy access to shopping and medical services. The unit had a small balcony where I could continue gardening in containers, and large windows that filled the rooms with natural light. It felt like a new beginning rather than a concession to age and limitation. As I settled into my new home, surrounded by neighbors who shared my interests and energy level, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The foundation was thriving, funding programs that were making real differences in people's lives while validating my belief in the importance of intergenerational connection. My relationships with Jennifer, David, and their families had evolved into something more authentic and mutually respectful than they had been in years. But most importantly, I had learned that I still possessed the power to shape my own life according to my values and priorities. I didn't have to accept dismissive treatment or settle for superficial relationships. I didn't have to define myself primarily through my role as a mother and grandmother, important as those roles remained to me. I could continue growing, learning, and contributing in ways that reflected my own interests and capabilities. The will remained as I had revised it, with most of my estate directed toward the foundation and related charitable causes. My family had come to understand and accept these decisions, recognizing that they reflected my deeply held values rather than temporary anger or confusion. They had learned to value our relationships for their own sake rather than as vehicles for future financial benefit. On a warm evening in early autumn, as I sat on my new balcony watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, I thought about Robert and what he would think of the path I had chosen. I believed he would be proud of my strength in standing up for myself, proud of the foundation's work in building stronger communities, and proud of the way our children had ultimately risen to become the kind of adults he had always hoped they would be. I had repeated my story about respect and attention 3 times through 3 changes to my will, and finally, my family had learned to listen. But more than that, I had learned that I could still write new chapters in my own story, still make choices that reflected my deepest values, still create something meaningful that would outlast my own life. The foundation would continue growing and evolving, connecting generations and preserving wisdom while creating opportunities for mutual understanding and respect. And I would continue living fully, purposefully, and authentically, surrounded by people who valued my contributions not because they had to, but because they chose to. Sometimes the most important lessons are the ones we teach ourselves about our own worth and power. Sometimes the most meaningful legacies are the ones we create while we're still alive to see their impact. And sometimes, when people say you're just repeating yourself, the answer is to keep repeating until they finally understand that what you're saying matters. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.